And here we are. Hi everyone, my name is Josh Cohen. Welcome to The Underground with Josh Cohen, a show we're going to examine various social, political, and cultural issues that the mainstream media may be ignoring. Accordingly, we will not be discussing coronavirus. Hope everyone's doing well, by the way. And wanted to just let you know we won't be covering coronavirus. I trust you can get your sources on that elsewhere. I'm going to start with a subject that's near and dear to me. Why, I still don't quite know. It's just captured me. And I've written 2 articles on it, one for my blog, Unfiltered Podcast with Josh Cohen, which we'll leave a link below, and then another for Kennington Press, which we'll also leave a link to as well. And this is the faux dictatorship of Nicolas Maduro in Venezuela. Since he took office in 2013, he's plunged his own country into beggary, misery, desolation, and despotism. The GDP in Venezuela has gone down something like 40% since he took office. Just to give you an idea, Venezuela was once the richest country in South America with the largest private reserves of oil on the planet, and they've gone completely down since embracing social sentiment from Hugo Chavez, passed on down to his Dauphin, Mr. Maduro. So I want to get right into it. And we'll go ahead and start. I will lay my case out for Maduro not only as a dictator, but also further into justifying potential intervention by America. And I'll get there by way of the United Nations. My argument will be that there's sufficient evidence, given the litany of war crimes and crimes against humanity that Mr. Maduro has done, that allows Venezuela to sacrifice state sovereignty. And I'll go through those points bit by bit as we go along. So on to it. So we'll start with an article that I wrote, in fact, last year on my blog, again, Unfiltered with Josh Cohen. And I do an examination of Venezuela, and in it I write, and it's something that shouldn't be forgotten. In fact, late last year, no less than 5 South American countries, as well as oddly enough Canada, have asked that Venezuela be placed under international investigation for crimes against humanity. The requests have been submitted to the Netherlands-based ICC, the International Criminal Court, for various offenses dating back to 2014, less than 1 year after Maduro succeeded Chavez. And that's important to bear in mind, too, because the ICC, as its own human rights tribunal, has basically what we refer to, we'll discuss later on, as the Rome Statute, of which Venezuela is a member. And what it effectively means is that Venezuela could have been placed under sanctions from the ICC as early as 2001, when they became conscripted members into the Rome Statute. Why the ICC has not pulled the trigger on this, I'm sure I don't know. Perhaps they just need us to watch The Underground and get a sense of what the case in Venezuela really is. Right, so the first piece I noticed, and I'll again lift from past Josh from about this time last year. I write, my gorge first began to rise toward Maduro as I read of the horrible atrocities committed just last year, now it would have been 2018, when it was reported that Maduro and his ilk were ordering that doctors withhold oxygen from patients who needed it. As Nicholas Casey reports in a rather insightful article, I'll be sure that we put the link to that article below in this video as well, he says, and to begin quote, "The Cuban doctors said they were ordered to go door to door in impoverished neighborhoods offering medicine and warning residents that they would be cut off from medical services if they did not vote for Mr. Maduro or his candidates." It's worth probably mentioning at this point that Hussein did something very similar under Hussein's Iraq, and this is well remarked upon in a wonderful book written by Kanan Makia. It's called The Republic of Fear. And it's probably the best 4-letter word one could have to describe the dread dictatorship of Hussein, where he forced the Iraqi citizens to come out in 100% turnout to vote for him. It wasn't enough for them to just say, well, we'll just count them as a vote. They had to actually shame and abject themselves to the point where they went into the voting booth and voted for this man who had advocated for the rape of their daughters, for the murder of their brothers, and the destruction of their homes. Well worth bearing in mind if you want to look towards what the Venezuelans have in their future. There was an article posted by Politico in mid-January where we get to the person who I want to see installed, and I would have to say Donald Trump does as well, Juan Guaido. And I'll read it out. This is published from Politico. On Sunday, the U.S. expected Juan Guaido, of 36, to be re-elected as the head of Venezuela's Operation-Controlled National Assembly. That position gave Guaido grounds to make the legal claim that he is Venezuela's interim president, which he's now referred to as in many circles, because Maduro's last election victory was marred by fraud. We'll have much more about the background of the National Assembly and why we believe it constitutes fraud in a future episode. But according to media reports, security forces loyal to Maduro blocked Guaido and many of his allies from entering the building. One video, and we'll be sure to post a link to this video below, I've seen it myself, showed Guaido trying to scale the gate and being pulled down by security guards, some of whom carried shields to push back the crowd. A political Caligula, if ever I've seen one. Now I want to get on to the OAS, the Organization of American States. The Organization of American States published an article, many pages long, that was in fact a anthology and compendium of the numerous crimes committed by Mr. Maduro under his government, under his regime. And this is a press release that the OAS released, excuse me, that details those findings. And I'll begin just with the brief bullet points. So among the findings, the report identifies identifies 131 murder victims of the 2014 and 2017 protests, where the perpetrator has been identified as a member of the state security forces and/or of the collectivos. And by the way, we'll be covering the protests as well. I'm seeing a much stronger proliferation of protests breaking out under Maduro's Venezuela, which leads me to become something of a cautious optimist, but more on that later. 2, identifies 8,292 extrajudicial executions recorded since 2015, about 2.5 years or so since Maduro achieved power. 3, identifies more than 12,000 Venezuelans arbitrarily detained, imprisoned, or subject to other severe deprivation of physical liberty since the 2013 presidential elections. 4, identifies more than 1,300 political prisoners, people that have been or still are detained because of their opposition to the government. I will repeat that. Identifies more than 1,300 political prisoners, people that have been or still are detained because of their opposition to the government. And I would invite you, ladies and gentlemen, brothers and sisters, peers and friends, to consider the frightening implications of that for a supposed free society. And then finally, 5, identifies a widespread and systematic pattern of abuse targeting an identified segment of the civilian population in Venezuela. It's this point where I want to get on to the 4 conditions under which a state may be deemed or said to have sacrificed its sovereignty. These are, if it participates against nuclear aggressions against neighboring states. Second, if it violates the terms of the letter and spirit of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and in other words, fools around promiscuously with the illegal acquisition of weapons of mass destruction. Third, if it should violate the Genocide Convention, the signatories to which are obliged without further notice to act either to prevent or punish genocide. And fourth, if it plays host, and I'm paraphrasing, to international gangsters, nihilists, terrorists, and jihadists. The case I want to make, the horse that I want to bet on, is that Venezuela most certainly is guilty of the third, the violation of the Genocide Convention. And should the UN find, by the way, Venezuela does have a seat at the United Nations, which makes it a member state of the United Nations. Should the UN find, ladies and gentlemen, that they are in fact guilty of that, that should designate immediate intervention by America into Venezuela. Obviously, we'll want to wait until this whole Corona business leaves, but it should be high up on our list of foreign affairs, in my view. So crimes against humanity are defined in Article 7 of the Rome Statute, as I mentioned before, as, begin quote, specific crimes committed as part of a widespread or systematic attack directed against a civilian population with knowledge of the attack. So if one can prove that there's knowledge of an attack by the government to the citizenry, then they've thus committed a crime against humanity, and thus, in my view, should be subject to potential intervention. And to cap it all off, as I mentioned earlier, Venezuela is a state party of the Rome Statute, and the ICC has jurisdiction over any crimes committed in the territory of Venezuela or by Venezuelan nationals since July 1st, 2002. And as I mentioned earlier, ladies and gentlemen, 2013, when Maduro assumed power, the ICC, once they had that doctrine submitted by those 5 South American countries and Canada, they could have, in my view, they could have acted upon it. Perhaps we'll keep tabs on the ICC and what they're doing as far as Venezuela, and be sure to keep you informed. So, you'll have to forgive me here, but I pulled a page from the OAS, from their document, and I want to, as they say, share it with you. Excuse me. So, in addition, the government's involvement in organized crime and drug trafficking has become an increasing concern, whereas the vice president of Venezuela was designated a narcotics trafficker. This wasn't me that said this, ladies and gentlemen. This is the OAS. This is an official government document by the U.S. Treasury Department in 2017 with, begin quote, with allegedly billions assets frozen, end quote. 2 nephews of Venezuela's First Lady have been convicted of drug trafficking in a New York federal court, end quote, as well as a growing number of indictments against senior government and military officials. Does this point to a sort of collusion, to a sort of high-end government corruption? I think it does. Recent reports also describe the threat of a growing presence of terrorist groups engaged in money laundering and drug trafficking networks. As the security situation worsens, it increases the threat against peace and security in neighboring countries. This is important to keep in mind too, because as I mentioned, one of the main reasons that could justify loss of sovereignty in the case of Venezuela would be if they participate against aggressions in neighboring states. We'll have to see how the situation unfolds with Venezuela with regards to its South American brothers. So I want to get on, staying on the OAS document for a moment. I wanted to call your attention, I should like to call your attention to a article I wrote for Kennington Press just a few weeks ago, as a matter of fact. I referenced the OAS document as well as the outbreak of protests that we've seen just last month. And I begin by saying, and I'll have to just inflate my lungs to the fullest capacity for this bit, the byproduct of the 2018 effort culminated in the exhaustingly titled Report of the General Secretariat of the Organization of American States and the Panel of Independent International Expert on the Possible Commission of Crimes Against Humanity in Venezuela. I was absolutely certain I was going to botch that, and I didn't. So I wanted to draw your attention to that. Page 57 of the document calls to mind what it refers to as extreme violence. And its finding regarding the relationship of the Venezuelan government under Maduro and extreme violence is summarized as follows. Begin quote, again, direct quote, I'm not editing or sensationalizing anything for you. Begin quote, it is evident that the current rates of violence in Venezuela are, at least in a significant measure, a consequence of a state policy to terrorize and subdue the population to prevent the people from claiming their rights or expressing opposition to our criticism of the government. Calling once again to government suppression and oppression of its people. And it does call murder in that regard as a crime against humanity, once again justifying intervention under international law. Again, international law, ladies and gentlemen. So, in summary regarding Venezuela, I was asked by someone earlier today, am I optimistic or pessimistic regarding Venezuela? And I say, well, as you can, I hope, tell, I've been following it for some time. It would seem to me that I have been saying for some time that if the government isn't changed, it will be changed by force. There will be a revolution. And I suppose I say that as someone that believes that that is a just thing to happen. But in many other ways, it makes me quite sad because it needn't have gotten this bad. It needn't have come this far, and it's going to get worse. And a lot of people, good people, are going to die. And in my view, and that by no means makes me a pessimist, but I should think it qualifies my optimism. So that's my general rundown, the terms of my indictment on Venezuela. I plan on staying on this and reporting back to you, but I hope you enjoyed it. I hope we'll leave all the links in the video description below, I should say, and I hope you enjoy it. On to other news. There was an article written by a friend of mine, Haley Kennington, for the online magazine which I also write for, called Kennington Press. Excuse me. Turns us back at least into the Western Hemisphere. Father risks jail. Let me try that again. Father risks jail to fight Canadian government-sanctioned trans child mutilation. So this has been a story which was put on my desk a little bit earlier today, and it's shocking to say the least. Call your attention to it. Activist judges are stripping parents of parental rights in Canada. Children have been coached into permanently changing their biological sex by means of hormones and/or surgery. And all possible measures have been taken to ensure that this travesty remains hidden from Canadian citizens. Part of the cover includes gagging guardians of the victims from speaking publicly. Excuse me, the article goes on to cite, in one specific case, Mr. Robert Hoogland. He defied the gag order. He, let me see, he at the time had a 6th grade daughter who was encouraged to change from a girl to a boy by, let's say, the school system, the counselors, the teachers, excuse me, doctors, and apparently even some of these activist judges. And this was done without Mr. Hoogland's knowledge and done without his authority to say so. And I'd like to know why the Canadian government thinks it's right to strip the rights of a parent to not know what their child is up to, especially on something as incredibly important as this. The story goes, I'm going to find the sheet here. The story goes that they found that she watched a video called Handsome and Majestic, which effectively proselytized the pro-LGBT stance. Now, to be clear, I have no issues with LGBT. I never really have. I'm sort of a do whatever you like so long as I don't quite have to hear about it. I think that's very, I ask nothing of them, and I just want the same in return. But in this instance, what we're seeing is an indoctrination. Upon seeing this video, the daughter, whose name I won't mention, the daughter decided that she now identifies as a man. This seems to me extraordinary, does it not? She's in 6th grade, for God's sake. I don't know about you, but I was most certainly woefully unaware of what my sexual identity was up until, well, probably about 2 weeks ago. But certainly much later on than that. I certainly wouldn't have trusted myself to make a decision as life-altering as that, and I think it's disgraceful. But you got to remember, Canada doesn't quite have the free speech. They do not have the First Amendment. They do not have the free speech that we have here. And it's worth remembering someone who I look up to a great deal, Dr. Jordan Peterson, how he first came into the national spotlight, the global spotlight even, was his opposition to Bill C-17. Which was an amendment to Canadian human rights legislation that was basically saying that if you choose to misgender somebody, a biological man who identifies as a woman, and you call this person a man, that you've therefore committed a hate crime. And you've committed a human rights violation, subject to all the pains and penalties that would infer. Dr. Peterson's stance, and I agree with him, is that this is a form of compelled speech. That the government tells you that you may not speak in this way, and that you may not say a word for fear of government, not intervention, that's not the word, government retribution. I spoke a moment ago in Venezuela of how the government has been suppressing and oppressing its people and been taking political prisoners, journalists, and the rest of them into custody. We in fact are seeing that in Canada in precisely that form. And it's well worth bearing in mind, if no other reason, it should be a reminder to us Americans, ladies and gentlemen, to recall just how lucky we are that we have a First Amendment that guarantees the separation, rather the freedom of speech, and that we may not be compelled to speak in a way just because the government chooses to ask us to do so. And that's all I have for you at the moment, ladies and gentlemen, brothers and sisters. Hope I may say peers and friends as our episodes go on. I really hope you enjoyed it. We'll carry on doing these, obviously. I'll be covering Venezuela and Canadian and domestic affairs as well. I want to give a quick shout out to the RAIR Foundation. That's RAIR. They were the organization that published my friend Haley's article. Check that out, KenningtonPress.com, which I also write for, and hope you enjoy it. Take care, and we'll see you next week.